Okay, chapter 13. The title of chapter 13 is Past Inspection. Many thousands of prisoners were being held in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Corrie and Betsy and the other women from Voot soon fell into the dull routine of life there. Every morning they were awakened by a whistle at 4 o'clock. A slice of black bread and cup of hot quote-unquote coffee were provided for breakfast, and then all prisoners were to be lined up in rows of 10 outside their barracks by 4:30. Sometimes they stood in line until 6 or 7 in the morning. At first this was not so bad, but as fall turned into early winter, many of the women could not stand in the cold for that long. A thud would be heard as someone hit the ground, followed by the footsteps and shouts of guards. Every prisoner knew what would happen next, but it was seldom talked about in the camp. It was too awful. Ravensbrück had a large gas chamber where weak and disobedient prisoners were put to death. Often, rumor had it, a prisoner was tricked into thinking she was going to have a shower before being sent to the hospital. She would strip of her clothes willingly, accept a fresh bar of soap, and join other prisoners, quote-unquote, showering in the room. Soon the metal doors would slam shut, and within minutes the surprised and terrified prisoners would be dead from breathing the poisonous gas that was let into the chamber. The bodies would then be thrown into a large incinerator that burned night and day. After roll call, the women would go to their work assignments. At first, Corrie and Betsy worked side by side at the nearby Siemens factory. Siemens was a large German industrial company that supplied Hitler's army. At the factory, the two sisters, along with hundreds of other sick and dying women, were made to push huge boxcars filled with scrap iron along the railroad track and inside the building, where they unloaded the boxcars by hand into huge bins. Sometimes a piece of iron would weigh hundreds of pounds, and a group of women would work together to heave it into a bin. The women worked beside German laborers who were paid wages for their labor and came to work with cheese sandwiches and boiled eggs for lunch, and at night went home to wives and children. Although they worked within a few feet of each other, the German workers never once looked over at the women from Ravensbrück. After 12 hours of back-breaking work, the women were marched back to the concentration camp, where they were given watery soup for dinner and then locked in their barracks for the night. Corrie and Betsy were in barracks 28, a long, low room. Instead of having cots to sleep on, it had rows of wide shelves stacked 3 high. Each shelf was only about 2 feet above the one below. The women were expected to sleep on the shelves. On her first night in the barracks, Corrie had been overcome by the noise and the horrible stench of vomit and human waste. The next morning she found out why. One of the prisoners told her there were over 1,400 women packed into a barracks designed to hold only 400, and those 1,400 women were locked in at night with only 8 backed-up toilets to use. Corrie decided that if ever there was hell on earth, Ravensbrück must be it. She had never imagined a more dirty, overcrowded, and cruel place could exist than Voot. Now, Voot is V-U-G-H-T, Voot. On top of that, Barracks 28 had the reputation of being the most flea-infested barracks in all Ravensbrück. Infested means swarmed in a troublesome manner. Because of this, the guards would stand at the door and bark orders, but they virtually never set foot inside. At first, Corrie had hated the fleas, but when she found they kept the guards away, she was grateful for them. At night, the 10 Boom sisters could hold Bible studies and prayer meetings for the other prisoners without being disturbed or caught. At first, just a handful of women were interested in listening to the Bible study, but slowly the mood in the barracks changed, and many women wanted to hear what the sisters had to say. Of course, in Ravensbrück, not all the women were Dutch. Women from all over Europe were imprisoned there, and a system for reading the Bible so they could all understand was soon developed. Excuse me. Betsy would read the Bible passage in Dutch, and German, and then other women in the room would translate it into French, Italian, Polish, and Russian. Night after night, the women listened to the Bible being read in this way, and after Betsy had shared about God's love for them all, they would sing a hymn together and pray. Soon, Barracks 28 became known as the, quote, crazy barracks where the women have hope, unquote. As winter approached, the women who went to work in the Siemens factory were each issued a coat. Then one morning they were not sent to the factory at all. Instead, Corrie and Betsy found themselves sitting on their quote-unquote bed in the barracks, knitting gray socks for soldiers. No one knew for sure why they no longer went to the factory. Some women were sure it had been hit by Allied bombs. After all, nearby Berlin was now a constant target of bombs from Allied aircraft. Betsy was a lightning-fast knitter and finished her quota of socks for the day long before anyone else. As soon as she had knitted the last stitch, she would take the Bible from its pouch and begin reading it aloud. Groups of women knitted quietly and listened as she shared about the importance of what she had read. Betsy encouraged the women to pray for the men who would be wearing the socks they were knitting. At first they laughed at her. It was impossible to think of praying for German soldiers. Surely God didn't expect them to do that. But Betsy read them passages about how Jesus had forgiven the men who nailed him to the cross, and they recited the Lord's Prayer together. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And slowly many of the women began to see and understand what being a Christian was really all about. Even though knitting was easier than factory work, Corrie began to worry more about Betsy's health. Betsy coughed and coughed during the long morning roll calls. And when Corrie took her to the hospital, she was told that Betsy was not sick enough to be examined by a doctor. No one with a temperature under 104 degrees was seen by a doctor. There was nothing Corrie could do for her sister but watch and pray. She noticed that when Betsy was holding a Bible study, she seemed quite normal, but the rest of the time she seemed to be in a sort of dream. She would lie in her sleeping space and say to Corrie, "We will be free before the new year. I can see us walking the streets of Harlem together. Yes, by New Year's Day, 1945, we will be free." Corrie would hug her tight with tears streaming down her face. Then Betsy would go on, "Corrie, think of all the people who will need our help when the war ends. We'll find a place for them to come to. It'll be a beautiful place. There'll be huge gardens, and the floors will be made of inlaid wood." Inlaid means set into a surface in a decorative design. Inlaid wood. Then she would speak as though she were standing in the entrance hall of such a place. "Look," she would say, "there are marble statues set in little nooks all along the walls. And the staircase, it is so wide and the windows are tall, right to the roof." Corrie often wondered whether her sister was imagining heaven when she spoke like that. With all her might, Corrie hoped and prayed that the war would be over soon, so that Betsy could get the medical help she so desperately needed. Every day, Betsy had less energy than the day before. Finally, one morning in mid-December, it happened. Betsy collapsed during roll call. The guards came for her and dragged her away, but she was taken not to the gas chamber, but to the camp hospital. Later that day, after she had finished her knitting, Corrie sneaked into the hospital to see Betsy. Betsy was lying comfortably in a bed. Corrie smiled at her. What a luxury. She had a whole cot to herself. But as ill as Betsy obviously was, she told Corrie she still had not been examined by a doctor. As Corrie bent over the bed to kiss her sister goodbye, Betsy grabbed her arm. Her eyes were shining brightly. "We must tell them, Corrie. We must tell them. There is no pit so deep that God's love cannot reach it." The next morning after roll call, Corrie raced back to see Betsy. She decided to check through the window first to see whether the way was clear. Corrie rubbed a clear patch in the icy glass and peered in. There were two nurses next to Betsy's bed. One was standing at the head of the bed and the other at the foot. As Corrie stared, they each lifted the corners of the bed sheet and carried it down the corridor with Betsy on it. Corrie stood rooted to the spot by the window. Her eyes had seen it, but her mind refused to accept it. Her big sister, her best friend, was dead. The nurses were carrying her body to the incinerator. Finally, Corrie backed away from the window and walked to the barracks. When she got there, the other women clamored for news of Betsy. Clamored means made a loud, continuous noise. A sad hush fell over the room as Corrie told them what she had seen. And that's the end of part 1.